Hello, everyone, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, Jack quietly turns Tu Tien's simple dream of a peaceful lotus pond into a beautiful surprise. But just as they begin enjoying the life they built together, a lonely, elderly man approaches their home carrying a briefcase filled with property documents and a secret that could change everything. Stay with us until the end, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. The morning in the mountains passed beneath the steady sound of tools striking the soil and leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. After several exhausting hours of work around the house, Jack and Tu Tien finally decided to take a break. They sat beneath the shade of a large tree in the front yard, where the air felt cooler and the harsh sunlight could no longer reach them. Tu Tien opened a small woven basket and took out several pieces of freshly boiled corn that were still warm. She handed one to Jack before sitting beside him. There was no expensive meal, elegant table, or carefully prepared breakfast. They simply shared warm corn beneath a tree after a long morning of physical work. Yet somehow, the moment felt more peaceful than any luxurious meal they had experienced before. While eating, Jack stared thoughtfully at an empty section of land near the wooden fence. Tu Tien noticed his expression. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Jack smiled and pointed toward the low area in front of the house. "I don't think we should build an ordinary fish pond there." Tu Tien tilted her head curiously. "What would you like to build instead?" "A lotus pond," Jack replied. "We could plant white lotus flowers, pink lotus flowers, and a few colorful water lilies. During the summer, the pond would make the yard feel cooler. Every evening we could sit on the porch and watch the flowers open." Tu Tien turned toward the empty ground and began imagining the peaceful scene he had described. Her eyes brightened. "I would love that." Jack gently took her hand. "Then we'll build it together. It doesn't matter if it takes time, as long as this place slowly becomes the home you've always dreamed about." Tu Tien rested her head against his shoulder. Surrounded by the smell of warm corn, the songs of forest birds, and sunlight passing through the leaves, a new shared dream quietly began. It did not begin with wealth or an ambitious plan. It began with two people looking in the same direction and believing they could create a peaceful future with their own hands. The flower order and Jack's discreet preparations soon after Tu Tien left for the watermelon field. Jack took out his phone and contacted a local plant nursery. He requested several varieties of lotus flowers and water lilies, including elegant white lotus plants, soft pink lotus plants, purple water lilies, and bright yellow varieties. The nursery owner sounded surprised when Jack asked for everything to be delivered that same afternoon. "Do you really need them that quickly?" the man asked. Jack looked toward the empty yard and smiled. "I want to surprise my wife." After completing several urgent company matters over the phone, Jack drove to a construction supply store. He personally selected a thick waterproof pond liner, a water hose, measuring rope, shovels, and several natural stones for securing and decorating the pond's edge. By the time he returned home, the sun was high in the sky. Heat rose from the dry ground, making the air feel almost impossible to breathe. Jack removed his outer jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and began digging. The blade of the shovel repeatedly struck the hard soil. Sweat quickly soaked through his shirt, but he refused to stop. He measured the depth, shaped the edges, and carefully created a gradual slope so the water would spread evenly across the pond. At one point, the shovel struck a large buried rock. Jack was forced to kneel and remove the soil around it with his hands before he could pull it free. No one was standing nearby to praise him or encourage him. Jack did not need recognition. Every shovelful of dirt he removed brought the promise he had made that morning closer to reality. He knew Tu Tien had never asked for expensive jewelry or luxurious gifts. She only dreamed of a peaceful place where their family could live together and enjoy the simple beauty of each day. By noon, the basic shape of the pond had appeared. Jack straightened his aching back, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and carefully examined the result. Although his arms were already exhausted, he continued leveling the bottom and adjusting every uneven section. He wanted everything to be ready before Tu Tien came home. When she returned, Jack did not want her to see only a pond. He wanted her to understand that every small dream she shared with him mattered, and that he listened even when she thought he had forgotten. CCN3. Tu Tien's watermelon harvest. While Jack worked tirelessly at home, Tu Tien arrived alone at the watermelon field beneath the mountains. Green vines stretched across the soil, and large, ripe watermelons rested between the leaves. Their dark green skins glistened beneath the sunlight. Tu Tien carefully inspected each watermelon, gently tapping the surface and listening for the deep sound that indicated it was ready to be harvested. She cut the ripe fruit from the vines, wiped away the dirt, and loaded each watermelon onto a small farm cart. The work was far from easy. The midday sun grew stronger, and sweat covered her forehead. Every time she lifted another heavy watermelon, her arms became more tired. Yet when she looked at the harvest produced through months of patience and hard work, she felt an honest sense of pride. After filling the cart, Tu Tien transported the watermelons to a small market near the village. She created a simple stall beneath a sheet of fabric that protected her from the sun. To show the customers the quality of the fruit, she cut open one watermelon. Its bright red flesh was fresh, juicy, and perfectly ripe. An elderly woman tasted a piece and smiled. "This is very sweet. I'll take two." News of the delicious watermelons quickly spread through the nearby market. More customers began approaching the stall. Some bought watermelons for their families. Others purchased several as gifts. Tu Tien greeted everyone warmly, weighed the fruit carefully, and always tried to choose the best watermelon for each customer. A familiar man from the village stopped near her stall. "Why are you selling by yourself today?" he asked. "Where is Jack?" Tu Tien arranged the few remaining watermelons and answered honestly. "He said he had something important to do at home, but I don't know exactly what it is." Within a surprisingly short time, almost the entire harvest had been sold. Tu Tien looked at the small container holding the money she had earned and smiled. It was not a great fortune, but every bill represented honest work in the future she and Jack were building together. She saved the most beautiful watermelon for him, packed the stall, and began her journey home. As she traveled, Tu Tien remembered their morning conversation about the Lotus Pond. She assumed they would begin building it together sometime during the following week. She had no idea that Jack had already turned their distant plan into a surprise waiting for her at home. The moment Tu Tien's vehicle passed through the wooden gate, she immediately realized that the yard had changed. The empty patch of ground she had seen that morning was gone. In its place was a carefully shaped foundation of a pond. A large waterproof liner rested nearby beside rows of natural stones. Under the shade of the tree, dozens of potted lotus flowers and colorful water lilies had been arranged neatly. Tu Tien stopped in the middle of the yard. For several seconds, she was too stunned to move. Jack appeared from behind the house. His clothing was covered with dirt, his hair was wet with sweat, and both hands were stained with mud. Despite his obvious exhaustion, he wore a proud smile. "You're home," he said. Tu Tien slowly approached the unfinished pond. "Did you do all of this today?" Jack nodded. "It isn't finished yet. I wanted to wait until you came home so we could plant the flowers together." Tu Tien looked at the white lotus plants, pink lotus plants, and colorful water lilies he had selected so carefully. She remembered their simple conversation beneath the tree that morning. At the time, she had believed the pond was only a small dream they might fulfill in the future. But Jack had turned someday into today. Tears began gathering in her eyes. "I only said that I liked the idea." Jack stepped closer. "I know, but I want you to understand that the things you dream about are important to me." Tu Tien gently touched the dirt covering his arm. She could imagine how long he had worked beneath the burning sun. "You handled company work all morning, and then you dug this entire pond by yourself. Why didn't you wait until I came home?" Jack smiled. "Because if I waited for you, it would have been another job. By completing part of it first, I could make it a gift." His simple answer caused Tu Tien's tears to fall. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, not caring that the mud on his clothing was staining her own. At that moment, the greatest gift was not the pond or the beautiful plants waiting beside it. What touched her most was knowing that Jack listened to her, valued her feelings, and remembered even the smallest things that brought her happiness. After placing the money from the watermelon sale somewhere safe and changing into work clothes, Tu Tien immediately returned to the yard to help Jack finish the pond. Jack told her she should rest after spending the entire day harvesting and selling watermelons. Tu Tien shook her head. This is our dream. I won't let you complete it alone. Together, they pulled the heavy waterproof liner across the pond. Jack stood inside the shallow foundation, carefully smoothing every fold, while Tu Tien held the edges to prevent the material from slipping. They arranged natural stones around the perimeter, using them to secure the liner and create a beautiful border. The work took longer than they expected. Mud covered their clothes. Their arms grew tired, and several stones refused to remain where they placed them. Whenever a rock rolled away or Jack accidentally splashed mud across Tu Tien's face, they looked at each other and laughed. When water finally began flowing into the pond, the liner gradually lowered and formed a small, clear pool in the middle of the yard. Jack removed his shoes and stepped into the shallow, muddy water. He carefully placed every plant in its chosen location. He planted the white lotus flowers along one side, the pink lotus plants near the center, and the purple and yellow water lilies around the edges. Tu Tien remained above the pond, handing each plant down to him. Every time Jack reached for another pot, their hands touched over the cool water. The afternoon sunlight slowly turned golden. As they prepared to place the final plant, Tu Tien suddenly pointed toward one of the pink lotus pots. Jack, look! Between the fresh green leaves, a small lotus bud was beginning to open. Standing in the middle of the pond, Jack followed her gaze and laughed with genuine happiness. It looks like the flower also wants to welcome its new home. Tu Tien knelt beside the water, her eyes glowing beneath the warm evening light. After an entire day filled with heat, sweat, and exhaustion, they were finally witnessing the first sign of life in the pond they had built together. It was not perfect. The stones were slightly uneven, and the water remained cloudy from the soil. But to Jack and Tu Tien, it was one of the most beautiful things they had ever created. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, the intense heat of the day slowly faded. Cool air traveled from the forest across the yard, carrying the smell of damp soil and young lotus leaves. Jack and Tu Tien washed the mud from their hands and feet before sitting together on the wooden porch. Tu Tien cut open the watermelon she had saved from the market. Its flesh was bright red, and she arranged several fresh slices on a small wooden tray. Jack took a bite and nodded with approval. This one is sweeter than the last harvest. Tu Tien laughed. That is because I chose it especially for you. In front of them, the new lotus pond reflected the final colors of the sunset. The young leaves moved gently across the surface, while the small pink lotus bud remained upright in the center of the water. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence did not feel empty or uncomfortable. After all the storms, misunderstandings, and losses they had endured, they had learned that some of life's most meaningful moments required no explanation. Tu Tien finally spoke. There were times when I thought we would never have a peaceful day like this. Jack looked at her. I thought the same thing. But we made it this far. Jack took her hand, and we will go even farther. There may still be difficult days ahead, but as long as we don't let go of each other, we can overcome them. Tu Tien rested her head on his shoulder and looked toward the shimmering water. The lotus pond had not simply changed the appearance of their yard. It reflected the journey of their own lives. It had begun in hard, empty soil. It had required painful digging, patience, and physical effort. Yet after being shaped by their hands and filled with care, it was finally ready to produce flowers. In the fading light, Jack and Tu Tien shared the sweet watermelon and quietly enjoyed a kind of peace they had fought through many storms to achieve. Not far from Jack and Tu Tien's home, an elderly man sat alone inside a modest rented room. An old brown briefcase rested on the wooden table in front of him. Its corners were worn from years of use. The man unlocked it and carefully inspected the documents arranged inside. They included the ownership papers for an old house, documents for a piece of land he had protected for many years, a savings account book, and the final valuable assets remaining after the painful changes in his life. Resting above the documents was a handwritten letter. The elderly man picked it up and quietly reread the words he had written. For most of my life, I believed a person's greatest wealth was everything they could hold in their hands. Only during these final years have I understood that the most precious gift is having someone who still remembers you and continues to call you family when you have nothing left to offer." His hand trembled. In the letter, he explained that he wanted to give everything he had left to Jack and Tu Tien. He was not doing it because they had requested anything. He was not attempting to purchase their affection or repay them for caring about him. He wanted them to receive his legacy because they had shown him sincere love during the loneliest period of his life. The elderly man placed the letter back inside the briefcase and closed the locks. Before leaving, he looked around the empty room one final time. In the distance, the lights inside Jack and Tu Tien's home had begun to glow. Holding the briefcase tightly against his chest, the man slowly walked toward the road leading to their house. He did not know how deeply his gift would affect them. He also did not realize that hidden among the old property records was another document, a secret document connected to Tu Tien's past. It was a document capable of changing everything she believed about her family. As the lonely figure approached the wooden gate, the first lotus flower in the new pond slowly began opening beneath the moonlight. A new home had just been completed, but an old secret was also on its way back.